Now I'd like to introduce our panel. We have joining us today a great group of security experts to talk about what they're seeing. We have Vanessa Pegueros, Chief Trust and Security Officer, OneLogin, Alex Rice, Co-founder and Chief Technology Officer for HackerOne, and Jon Oberheide, Co-founder and CTO at Duo. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks.
So, thanks for coming. The events of the last week have shown the potential dangers of cyber attacks, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. As has been well documented by Bloomberg and others, the coronavirus has been a boon for hackers, both criminal gangs and the state-sponsored variety. Those problems have been exacerbated by the explosion of people working from home. How can companies prepare for these risks, particularly as working from home becomes a more long-term phenomenon? So the first question I wanted to ask you has to do with the events of the last week. Should C-suite executives continue to tweet? More broadly, what lessons should they take from the cyber incidents that occurred in the last week, which includes the hack at Twitter, Russian announcement that Russians had tried to hack COVID research, and today the indictment of 2 Chinese hackers for attempting to hack COVID research and intellectual property. Anyone?
Well, I'll kick it off. I think to your first question, I don't see any difference in C-suite activity on Twitter as a way of communicating to the public or to shareholders or stakeholders. Some of the underlying risks that were represented in those different incidents are not necessarily a new trend. It's something that organizations are facing on a daily basis, and that's the fact that users and their access represent the soft underbelly of most businesses. So we've seen, over the past 5-10 years, the focus from attackers going after networks and infrastructure and servers to achieve their ends, and start to focus on attacking the end users of those organizations and using that to gain access to data or systems that they can monetize.
Yeah, I would actually add to what John said is I think the details of the specific attack on Twitter are still kind of unfolding. I think once we get a little bit more firm details on that, if we eventually do, I think companies will take those details and the lessons learned around that and try and strengthen their own security posture. So I think that's something every time a breach occurs, companies should take the lessons learned, understand what happened, and strengthen their own security posture.
I think something I'd add to it is
Alex, if I can turn to you. Yep. Sorry.
Are people still using Twitter after this? And +1 on John, we haven't seen anyone using it less. But the core question to Twitter is, how do you rebuild trust in an environment like this? And I think I'd give them props for the transparency that they're displaying on their response so far in what happened, what steps they're taking. That's a critical step in rebuilding trust. And one of the unfortunate parts of that transparency is that it's revealed that this was attacking humans more than technology. And one trend, an unfortunate trend that I see and people responding to that, is kind of this classic cynical, it was social engineering, or it was a human at fault and humans are the problem here. I just think that's a really a failing strategy of how to interpret this. We should be expecting that humans are targeted in this way. We should expect humans to make mistakes. We should expect humans to be fallible. And we should look to what are the technology solutions that we could have in place to prevent something like this, starting from the edge access controls, device authentication. How can you prevent a phishing attack like this from occurring in the first place? Once that access does occur, it's wise to assume that you will have malicious actors there. How should the interface respond? Things like two-factor or two-man rules on important actions, like resetting a popular Twitter account and the like. And then on the flip side of that, just empathy for the human victims on the other side of this is this pushback on the security teams that are struggling to defend this. And I'd urge everyone here to remember that the Twitter security team is a group of great individuals, one of the more well-funded security organizations on the planet. And even they're struggling with this. And when they're reflecting in an incident like this, there's always a list of things that they would have loved to have done to prevent an incident like this that struggled to get the business prioritization that it needed. And so the takeaways that I would have from all of this for folks listening are: we should expect humans to fail. We should plan accordingly. And it takes a lot of work to get there. And we need to be investing in making our technology more resilient to defend against situations like this.
Yeah, thank you. John,
it's really unfortunate when we move towards blaming end users for security incidents. Tell end users don't plug that thing into your computer, don't open that attachment, don't click on that link. It's like, these are the activities that you have to do to be on the internet and to be a productive individual in your organization. So we need to move from a model of blaming the end user for just trying to do their job and try to meet users where they are in terms of their accessibility to technology, their adoption, their usability, because you might want to force your end users to jump through a bunch of hoops to gain access to some on-premise file sharing application. But if you make it that hard for people to do their job, they're just going to go use Dropbox, and they're going to subvert any security controls that you tried to put in place.
Yeah. Alex, what does the current threat landscape look like, and how has it changed since the pandemic has began, if at all? Who are the bad guys?
A lot of the focus has been on the tactics and the techniques and the lures that people are using. And we should just reminded that criminals are always opportunistic. They'll always follow the top trends. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they're changing to this trend. And I think most organizations, once they realize that, are well equipped to deal with it. What's meaningfully different about the threat actors and the threats that organizations are facing now is not that the bad folks have changed or that their goals have changed. It's that the attack surface has increased dramatically. Organizations that weren't prepared to treat their home environments and many of their end users as front and center attack surface to their enterprise are the ones that are struggling the most to keep up here. So I'd kind of just echo that from the ground: is don't spend too much time worrying about the flavor of the week attack, and spend a lot of time really assessing what are those new areas and new attack vectors for us in a home environment post-COVID.
And, Andy, I'd like to add to what Alex said, that, there's really crime as a service is a real thing. And with a complete supply chain of products and services such as exploit kits, custom malware, botnets, ransomware, and these products and services have become commoditized, and anyone can gain access to them. So more people are utilizing these tools. I recently saw a stat that you could rent a botnet for as little as $8.94 an hour. So this is very accessible technology and products and services in the crimeware space that now are making it much easier for anybody to who has that intent to leverage those products and services.
Sticking with that theme on the bad guys, John, you were a high school hacker, as I understand. And let's pretend that you had a more malicious intent than you probably did back then. How easy would it be to exploit the pandemic for financial gain, and how would you do it?
Well, back 2 years ago when I was in high school, I'm kidding, many moons ago when I was in high school, unfortunately, things were, I would say it's easier now to compromise your average organization than it was back then. And it really has to do with how IT has evolved over the past decade or two. It used to be a little more simple to reason about our IT and security when everything was literally within your four physical walls. Your employees came into the office, they accessed applications and the network and data that was within the building. using devices that stayed within the building, locked to a physical desk. And that was a different kind of security model that we built. We built really high walls of the castle and put a moat around it, and that was sufficient to protect our organizations. But that kind of M&M security model with like the crunchy exterior and the gooey interior doesn't really work in the modern world when your users have certainly left the building. Your devices are very heterogeneous. They might be mobile or PC. They might be managed or unmanaged. And certainly your applications have gone to the cloud, hybrid environments. Some are certainly still in the data center. So we've seen those trends kind of play out over the past decade. And I think COVID and that shift to work from home has just accelerated that transformation, even for some of the most conservative organizations out there. So all of those challenges that organizations are trying to figure out how to adapt cloud services, embrace mobility in their organizations, deliver highly usable, highly productive services to their employee base to be competitive in their respective markets. The same things that represent the positive side of productivity also represent the risk of account takeover, of phishing, of device compromise. So when you move to a work from home environment, you just kind of exacerbate all of those factors. For example, we had customers that were shifting to work from home, and there wasn't even enough laptops to supply to their employees, both due to supply chain issues with hardware, but also just due to the kind of rapid shift and rapid demand. So employees are going home, they're pulling out, the Windows XP laptop that's in their drawer and trying to log into the corporate network in a safe and secure way as possible. And our technology.
Gaming computer.
What's that?
I said, or their teenagers' gaming computer.
Yeah, a shared computer in the family that's laden with who knows what malware or what risk it represents to your organization. So people are just trying to do their best job to be productive. So a lot of organizations that had prepared for that were in much better shape, and then there were other organizations that just had to rip the Band-Aid. Maybe they're planning to migrate to cloud services, and they just said, "Hey, we're going to push the button, this weekend because we've got to adapt to this new model."
Vanessa, OneLogin did a survey that found that 40% of respondents over the age of 55 had never changed their Wi-Fi passwords. I wondered, what is the general state of remote work hygiene? Has it changed since March? And what's a sort of realistic expectation for a work from home policy? Can I stream baseball games while I'm working?
Yeah, I'm not sure the state of work from home has changed a ton since March. I think, at least on the employee side, I think there's been more campaigns of awareness that the company has been sharing with their employees. But I do think, as John mentioned, companies have had to speed up their deployment of technology, whether it's like cloud-based identity access management, VPN, or cloud-based endpoint protection software. The companies have had to rush to kind of get that implemented, as well as some of the more basic things that John mentioned, like getting the laptops out there. I think at OneLogin, we've seen an increase in customers interested in learning about MFA, as well as how do they secure their VPNs. So there has definitely been that kind of acceleration. I think in terms of policy, I'm going to be a little harder on the end user than John and Alex. I think there is some real obligations that our end users have. And that might be the contrast between a CTO and a CISO, or its chief trust and security officer. But I have some basic points around policy that I think are sensible. One is really try not to let anyone else in your household use your work computer. I know it's tempting, let your kids jump on it, or, maybe even your spouse or partner. So I think that's actually a really smart thing, not to allow that. And again, there's our exceptions in the case of somebody doesn't have a computer. I get that, but in general, I see policy as aspirational. So I think don't download or use applications that are not directly related to your job on your work computer. So Andy, that would kind of answer the question. I'm not sure you want to stream the Cubs game on your work computer. And there's definitely been an increase relative to social engineering attacks and phishing. So I know humans aren't perfect, but that doesn't relieve us from like making sure that we try and educate them as much as possible, and basically like don't click on attachments from unknown people, and don't, if something looks suspicious, don't open it up, and like basic, in my mind, common sense things. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to push our end users to that common sense approach. Also, I'd say don't access your don't access your company applications from any other computer, but your work computer. And I know, again, that may have some exceptions, but generally we should be keeping data and company data on our company assets and systems. So like keeping that there. And then for those, technical people out there in the audience, I wouldn't tamper with or disable any computer security software on your computer. I mean, believe it or not, that is happening. And then finally, with an increase in ransomware that we've seen during this time, I would make sure you back up your computer, because the possibility of possibly getting ransomware and then having to have your laptop wiped and all the data gone is a real possibility. So those would be some of the basic points on some policy.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex in New York. What is your view on zero trust endpoint protection, and what should organizations be doing about it?
Ooh, I love it. Okay, so I work at Duo. We're a provider of zero trust platform. We're primarily known for strong authentication, but to the question in the tweet, a lot of organizations still aren't nailing the basics. And what I mean by the basics are like, who are all your users? What are their devices? Are they safe? Are they risky? Are they up to date? Are they Chromebooks? Shout out to our sponsor. And how do I provide seamless access to applications in this new world, so that if I'm accessing an on-premise application or I'm accessing a cloud application, the user shouldn't need to know. They should just click a link and they're accessing all of their corporate applications. So that's how we think about zero trust, is like any user from any device to any application in a safe and usable way. And that endpoint protection piece is a big piece of it, because it's not just strong authentication of who's on the other end of the device, but it is that question of what device is it being used. Is it that Windows XP laptop that's shared with my kid at home? Or is it a fully up-to-date managed iOS device that I have very strong confidence, assurance, and controls that is allowed to access, my ERP system? So that's our kind of platform to say not all access is equal. If you're accessing the cafe menu, maybe you allow that Windows XP machine to see what's on the menu today. Not that any of our corporate cafeterias are open, but if you're accessing sensitive applications, internal applications, then you might want to kind of raise that bar of trust before allowing access.
John, you sort of touched on this in your answer here, but what are some of the questions CEOs and company security professionals should be able to easily answer, to ensure they're adequately protected in this current environment?
Yeah, I think that is kind of the three questions of like, who are all my users, what are their devices, and what applications are they accessing? It's kind of that basic inventory. And you can tell a lot about the sophistication of or the maturity of an organization's security program by how quickly and how precisely they can answer those questions. And it's not to say that the basics are easy. Sometimes the basics and the fundamentals are really hard to accomplish. But you should be putting your focus and your resources towards some of those questions versus maybe some of the more esoteric threats that you might see out there. So just like Alex mentioned around like worrying about the threat du jour, is it Russia after my COVID research? Is it, cyber criminal X, Y, or Z? They're using a lot of the same techniques to compromise organizations. So I think it's better to focus on like, what are the fundamentals that I need to do really well, so I can free up my limited security team and resources to focus on some of those higher order threats that might be more specific to my business.
I would I would also add that you should be asking, how are you monitoring and gaining insight into what's happening in your environment in a continual way? So having the tools and having the systems in place, but most importantly now is like, how do I actually monitor and understand what's going on in my environment?
Andrew, I think I
Great.
should put it into
Yep.
context.
Go ahead,
Uh,
Alex. I'm sorry.
the question we had a minute ago around is it true that 40% of people still have their default Wi-Fi router passwords? And if we kind of zoom out on that, it shouldn't matter. The answer is yes, of course they do. And if any part of your security model is dependent upon your work from home or end users Linksys or Netgear or consumer grade network being secure, then you should really be reassessing your security assumptions and your security posture. Your old perimeter is just a lie, and it's we have to get out of that mentality of these high walls. And if you try to extend that to somebody's house, it's just not going to work. And so you've got to zoom out of that mentality as quickly as you can and really focus on how do we trust the actual devices that are in it. And it's hard. Some organizations are further along. Those basics are really tricky to get right. But you need to realize what that end state needs to look like, and focus in on what are those pieces of our security model that we can trust, that we do have trust in.
Alex, I think you're kind of moving towards this next question, which is there any positive changes that have emerged since the pandemic began in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I do think this is a positive. It's an acceleration of what a better security model is. It's forcing an evolution of many organizations that for a long time were just dragging their feet on productivity of end users. And I think I'd highlight a broader trend than that. Is one of the positive things that I've seen is we are starting to develop security programs and security practices that have empathy for the end user and empathy for the business at the heart of it, right? Instead of the security organizations that were used to saying no and getting their way and thinking that was okay, we're seeing the security leaders that are most effective and most respected during this transition are the ones that say, you know what, this does start from, we're here to enable the business. People are not just working from home, they're dealing with a pandemic, they are dealing with the realities of racism and people waking up to Black Lives Matter and protests outside their house. And there's just a lot going on that warrants security being an enabler, starting our policies from what do people need to be hacked, be effective and productive and add value to the business. And I just think that's got to be the path forward. And I'm glad to see it happening in so many organizations.
Yeah, back in 2003, there was a group of CISOs that formed this group called the Jericho Forum, and this was a precursor to like Google's Beyond Corp and what we call zero trust, and they coined this term of deperimeterization. Originally, they saw this kind of future of mobility and cloud before it even existed, and they called this a collaboration-oriented architecture. And it's interesting now that this has played out and is playing out even more as we all try to collaborate remotely and virtually. So I think as a whole, kind of pulling forward maybe like 5 to 10 years of digital transformation through the shift from work from home is actually a really healthy thing for employee productivity, for making sure that you have sufficiently greased your IT and security stack that they can be flexible and adaptive. But I think it's really unclear, like if you can put the remote work toothpaste back in the tube. Like I don't know how many organizations are going to snap back or on what timeline now that we've been in this environment for a good part of the year.
I just wanted to add that I think that a big impediment to digital transformation has been not actually the technology, but the people and some of the resistance to change around these technologies. So I think a really positive aspect of COVID and what's gone on is that people have had to get out of the way because there was actually change that the organization needed to adapt to in order to survive and conduct their business. So I think that has been a big benefit because I feel it's going to help companies in the long run now that they have become more comfortable with this technology. It's going to allow them more flexibility. And ultimately, they'll be more competitive in the marketplace, adopting these new technologies. So I think that's a big benefit.
Yeah. We have a question from Douglas in Virginia. What are the most important steps a CISO should take immediately to minimize the risk of the spike in exploits?
So I'm the one, kind of fully 100% security person. Honestly, I think a good CISO, a good security leader, is prepared for many different kinds of situations and crisis. And I think that everything that we should be doing is kind of what we are doing. I think to a comment that was made earlier, I think there could be different prioritization of efforts, existing efforts, based on the current crisis situation. So I think that is the one thing that would change. You would have to relook at your kind of portfolio of initiatives and say, which of these is much more critical now than maybe it was prior to the crisis. So I think taking that business look and getting broad adoption across the business around that reprioritization is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, I would say, like, virtually, of course, locking yourself in your room with your CIO. Your CIO is going to be forced to make dramatic changes to, productivity, to remote access, to supply chain for the organization. And all of those big changes are going to have downstream security impact. And so if you don't have that really close partnership to be prepared for that change coming down the pike, then you might end up exposing yourself to more risk. And I think a big piece of that is modernization. Moving to cloud services can have a net positive security benefit. Moving to modern devices and a modern fleet with Windows 10 and with Chrome OS can greatly strengthen your security posture. So trying to figure out how your security roadmap and your risks align with the rest of your digital transformation projects in the business.
Yeah, I kind of answered in two parts. Plus one on the most important thing to get right is get everyone aligned on that this is not temporary, that this is permanent, and we need a longer term strategy for how we accelerate this and get this going. That's the hardest thing to get right and is the most important one to set up first. And then from a more specific CISO perspective, what are the quick things that you could be doing right now to help build up a shared understanding of what that means and what the risks are and how you manage it, is that we've seen quite a few organizations kind of shift their security assessment practices to really focus on these new expansion of their attack surface, things like IR tabletops that specifically target how we do instant response in a home environment, folks expanding the scope of their bounty programs to include more social engineering techniques and home environments as the attack surface, internal applications, things that 6 months ago were not part or not front and center at somebody's external attack surface are things that you can just start help building up a shared understanding of what does that look like today versus the beginning of the year.
So Vanessa had mentioned earlier sort of crime as a service, and the fact that there's more amateurs who've taken up hacking. At the same time, some cyber attackers have become more sophisticated, targeting ransomware at specific companies, mapping their networks, and even sending zero-click malware, as appeared to happen with Jeff Bezos in January, I believe. Can you talk about that and how much security professionals should worry about protecting themselves against the most sophisticated hacks from nation-state hackers or criminals that are at the top of their game, for lack of a better word?
I think all security is risk assessment. So, if you're the CEO of a large public company, then you definitely should include, well-funded, very sophisticated adversaries in your threat model. But as we talked about a little bit previously, like worrying too much about the who is doing the hacking, I think can distract you from the how. both amateurs, whether it's crimeware as a service or nation state well-funded adversaries, are going to be using some of those same tactics of phishing and endpoint compromise and taking advantage of that Windows XP laptop that we've mentioned so many times that's sitting at home. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. So especially in this remote work environment, trying to figure out what threat model you need to defend against. For example, if you're worried about that Windows XP laptop at home, maybe you put in place some policies for your corporate access to say, you must be this tall to ride the ride. You must be coming from a managed device to access the sensitive application.
I think that going back to my comment around security, visibility, and monitoring, the most sophisticated attack could start with a phishing email, and a very simplistic attack can start with a phishing email. So we don't know what that initial attack is going to evolve into and how sophisticated the attacker is. So really understanding and being able to track that activity through your environment, and the noticing when something more sophisticated occurs is important to correlate all that together to understand that you're in the midst of a very sophisticated attack. So I think you don't know until it starts to happen, unfortunately, and therefore you shouldn't ignore anything that you might think, oh, that's just not a big risk, or it's not a big issue, because it could turn into a very big issue. So, kind of that life cycle management of an attack and understanding where it's at and what they're doing and correlating data is super important. So
I think one of the biggest things that we get wrong as an industry is our tendency to focus on those headline grabbing attacks, the what if, the nation state, the APT, et cetera, because it's exciting and it feels achievable. But where we see time and time again with our customers, where we primarily work on hacker simulation or attack simulation and how are people going to get breached, it's not from targeted one-click malware to the CEO. Speaking generally, there are exceptions to that, but the vast majority of us need to be focusing our time and energy on the basics, and the basics are hard, and it's been a grind, and we've stayed away from it because of how much pushback we've got from the business and our partners. But the message I would leave everybody with is now is the time to capitalize on the amount of support you're going to get from other executives, from how collaborative security is becoming, from the willingness from your CIO to kick off some of these big projects around endpoint protection and fleet modernization. Now's the time to do it. And so now I would not be focused on how do we defend against these attack of the day or attack du jour, as John said it. And let's invest in getting the basics right and doing what's right for our users.
Great. I think that's a great way to end this. Thank you for everyone.